Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today, what we wanted to talk about is the way in which we manage and deal with getting feedback on our products, on our apps, both in terms of from customers, but I think one of the things that I really wanted to unpack a little bit is the way that we handle feedback when products are in their earlier stages. So things like beta testing or early interactions with customers. Because something that I find really complicated when I'm developing an app or developing a major update is I will have in my mind a vision for what I want that update to do, what I want the app to do. And I kind of am working towards that. But in this early sort of like embryonic state, it's only in my head and in the little prototypes and the little bits of code that I'm building. And something significant, though, happens the first time you ever show it to someone else, even beyond just telling someone the idea. But when you actually show them something and you give them something to react to, the way that you think about the app seems to change for myself, because suddenly it has their feedback, their suggestions, their ideas start to be kind of mixed in and muddled along with mine. And so something that I've learned is that I have to be really, really careful about how I get that feedback, at what point I get that feedback, and the way in which I sort of manage it. Because what I don't want to do is take too much feedback too quickly and kind of lose that vision for what I want to do, for what I want the app to be or what I want the update to be. And so it's something it's a weird discipline that I think you kind of have to learn. And I was curious, though, if you've had a similar set of experiences, how do you go about kind of pulling in that feedback?
During early development, I will usually, ask close friends for input on certain basic decisions about it, basic feature decisions, how things might be structured, what features might need to be necessary or unnecessary. And then I've recently, in recent years, gotten really a big fan of medium-sized private betas. For me, the private beta is extremely useful, and I've done a number of sizes of betas. I first, in the early days of Overcast, I was doing a beta of I think 20 people. I've also since then done betas with 800 people because TestFlight allowed you to do 1,000. Now it's actually 2,000, but so that I did 800 people on a beta that was I basically had a public sign-up form and just would let almost anybody in. More recently, I've done much smaller betas, going back to that original size of 20 to 40 people again. And what I found is that the quality of the feedback doesn't actually seem to change significantly with the size of the beta, and which is counterintuitive. But it seems like you can show the app to a relatively small number of people, and you'll pretty much get all the feedback you need from a small group. And maybe not a small group of 2, but 10 or 20 people. If they're actually going to use it and give you feedback, which is a separate point, but if they're actually going to use it and give you feedback, you don't need that many people involved in the group. Now, the feedback you get, it tends to be really focused or really heavily weighted towards upfront feedback, right the very first time somebody uses a beta. Because, and I don't know if other people do this, but I do this, where if somebody gives me a beta, I will usually take a lot of time going through the app that very first time and giving pretty detailed feedback to them. But after that first time, as more updates come in, I very rarely ever take that amount of time again, unless I spot an obvious bug, then I can screenshot it, send it to them, whatever. But general feedback about a beta or about an app, it's usually front loaded, and I found that to be the case with most of my testers as well. So what I will usually do is, if I can, I will have a few new testers in every group, and TestFlight allows you to see who among the group didn't install the latest few versions. It'll tell you the last version each person installed. So if I see some of my testers losing interest, if they just don't install the updates, or if the last update they installed was 5 builds ago, I'll just quietly remove them from the list. And it's no hard feelings, because I do that all the time. I always fall out of betas all the time because I lose interest, or I don't have time in that month or whatever. So I usually will cut people who kind of aren't using it. And no hard feelings. A lot of times they're my friends. I don't even doesn't matter. No hard feelings. And then I will add a few new people every time, because it allows me to get that initial impression, somebody's first impression of this app. It allows me to have that ongoing throughout the process, rather than showing it all to the same group of people right up front and never bring any new people in along the way.
So I've only recently started doing beta testing properly at all, I would say. Like the most recent update I did for Pedometer++ was the first time I'd ever done a big update, a big beta test before I launched something big. And, before that, it had only really been, I would, I would have it running on my own phone, maybe my wife's, maybe a few, like one or two other people, and honestly, then on a lot of testing devices. But I'd never had that experience of having this big kind of like wide, like I did a similar kind of thing. Like I just said, anybody who wants to beta test Pedometer++, let me know. And I went to test flight and I put them all in. And I had an interesting thing that was sort of like similar to your experience, where you get this big wave of comments and this big wave of feedback early on. And then it sort of dies down. And then actually what I found is you ended up with another wave like a week later with sort of like now that I've been using it for a while, here's like some other thoughts. And I would say that I had a very similar kind of experience to you insofar as there's only a certain amount of feedback was actually helpful. And like beyond that, you start to get a lot more repeats. You start to get a lot more tangential things. But like at its core, what I found helpful in the beta test was validating, that the app works and is functional in the way that I need it to be. And then two, it's validating that it's a good idea. That people are like, I'm not getting the like, what? This doesn't make any sense. Or people who've used the app before and going to this version are like, this doesn't make, you're totally breaking the thing that made the app good before. Because I think those are the things that I find that I struggle with as myself, because I've been working on an update for several months. My experience with the app at that point becomes almost exclusively the new version of the app and not what the existing version in the App Store is. And I can tend to lose sight of the distance that I'm creating between those two things, because I never go back to, or other than for like my final acceptance testing, like I won't go back to the App Store, download the version and run that for a few days. Like that's just not typically the way I do it, because obviously I'm constantly running development builds on my own machine. And the feedback that I got was that was most helpful is when I have someone who's like, so I used the old version yesterday and I used the new version today, and this felt weird by going from there to there. And like those types of feedback are things that are really hard for me to do, because like I said, I have this whole new vision for the app. I've imagined and built features around this whole new thing, and that's what I'm used to. And months later, like sometimes the weirdest one is when you go back to the App Store version, you're like, what is this? Like, I can't believe, not even necessarily like, oh, I can't believe this shipped, but like, whoa, this is different. Like this functions in a different way. This has lots of other issues. And so that was something that I learned from this feedback. It's like, I'll get these little like, this was weird coming from that. And that's helpful both in terms of from a development perspective, but then also in terms of what questions are my beta testers going to have about the app? What's weird to them? What's new to them? And then when I take that feedback, I can structure my documentation or my like release notes or things to be like, if you're coming from the old version to the new version, you might find this weird. If you find this weird, this is the answer to your question. But that's something that I was never able to do before I was able to find test flight. Like I have a broader audience, and something that I definitely now I think will use going forward. Whereas before I always view test flight as like, oh, it's beta testing. It's just like making sure that there's no crashers. It's making sure there's not a lot of things. But understanding customer perspective changes from the old to the new was really helpful.
And even when starting out new, I mean, the initial Overcast beta I did for 1.0 before the app was out was incredibly valuable, because when you're developing an app, when you're only using it yourself, like you mentioned, I do the same thing where like I'll use it myself for like months, and as soon as I can get it running on my phone, I will use it myself full time. And when you're developing the app yourself, you know how to use it and you know what you did, so everything makes sense to you. And when you first show it to beta testers, especially for a 1.0 where they are not familiar with the app before, the most valuable perspective I got was what doesn't make sense or what is being misunderstood from what I intended. And I made tons of interface improvements and tons of changes during that initial test. I thought that a beta test would just be like, oh, just let me know if anything crashes or breaks, and then I'll ship it in a few weeks. And it turned out to be months long, because everybody gave really good feedback about, this doesn't really make sense, or I don't understand what this is. And the app, I dramatically improved the app. It was almost like shipping at version 2.0, rather than shipping 1.0, because I had such great feedback just by asking people. And again, you don't need this is only a group of like 20 people. It doesn't need to be a big group. It just needs to be people who aren't you, because you get everything you did because you did it and you designed it. And as soon as you show anybody else, you immediately will see the flaws in what you did, because you will see them either struggling to understand what you did, or misinterpreting things, or missing entire big features because they just don't see them, or they don't see why they would need them or something. And it's great. Like my effects panel in Overcast looked totally different when I shipped the 1.0 beta, the very first beta. Voice Boost didn't even exist by that name. It was actually a boost slider, and it had 4 different modes, and and Smart Speed was it was there, but everything was kind of rearranged differently. And over time, and the wording, the labels were all different. And over that beta, I was able to really refine that panel, reduce voice boost down to either an on or an off, which was actually it was its strongest setting. I realized halfway through development, like, actually, I always just leave it at the strongest setting because that's the best. So I'll just eliminate the other ones and just make it the strongest setting. And it, stuff like that would reduce user confusion in the beta. I rearranged major parts of the interface during the beta. The directory was dramatically changed and added to during the beta. I mean, so many things in the interface, so many changes, so many, wording of microcopy in the interface and everything. So much of that was improved simply by asking people, like, hey, what do you think of this? And watching what they said and seeing what they got and what they didn't get and what they misunderstood. Under the Radar this week is sponsored by ImageX, imgix.com/UTR. ImageX is basically, it's hosted image processing and image resizing. So you kind of give them like a back-end source of images, whether it's your web server, an S3 bucket, or even just arbitrary URLs that you sign and have them process. Then you can just serve their URLs for those images in your apps, on your websites, anywhere that you need an image served over HTTP. And you can do real-time processing on that image just by URL parameters to their service. So I use ImageX. I used it for a while for Overcast thumbnails. It is a fantastic service for just basic things like resizing. Like all I need to do with Overcast thumbnails most of the time is resize them and serve them over a fast CDN. And it does that flawlessly. I have no complaints about that at all. But also what it does is a little more fancy stuff. Like, for instance, you can automatically serve different DPI to different screens. So like if you have a device that it has a Retina screen versus one that doesn't, it can automatically serve the right DPI to that to not waste bandwidth or not look bad. You can automatically serve things like the WebP format to devices that support WebP, things like that. There's all sorts of great stuff you can do automatically. And then also you can actually adjust the images by using those URL parameters. So you can do things like change the colors, crop them in different ways, rotate them, add annotations. I mean, there's so much you can do with this. Pretty much any kind of like image filtering task that you can do, so much editing technique you can do here just by changing URL parameters. And it all runs on their proprietary system that is all like GPU accelerated. It is so fast. I've never seen an image processing CDN that works this quickly, and that's why I use them. ImageX's API is very easy to use. I just wrote my own thing myself to do it in like one function. But if you want any other kind of library support, they have tons of libraries for different languages, including one for Swift from the developers over at Hodinkee. So check this out, imagix.com. That's imgix.com/UTR for Under the Radar. Thank you very much to ImageX for sponsoring our show.
Once you're out of this beta phase, like you've gotten all this good feedback from your beta, then you have the interesting thing of how do you transition to feedback from customers more generally? So you're past this point where, fair enough, you've got all this great feedback from a small group of people. You open something up, you put it out as a broader update to lots of people, and then things get really interesting, or at least complicated, because suddenly you have lots and lots of customers who all have different visions for your app. All have different goals for your app, and just by the volume of the virtue of having so many numbers, hopefully your app is going to have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. You're going to have such a wide and varied user base at a certain point that the feedback you get and the way you collect and manage that becomes like an engineering problem in and of itself. It's something that I've over time had to kind of become more comfortable with the understanding that I'm never going to make everybody happy. Like, that's just a given. Like, right off the bat, if you ever are kind of trying to build an application catering to everybody, you're going to end up building like a terrible application because you just can't do it. You're never going to make something that makes everybody happy, but you still are going to get a lot of feedback. And that's a good thing. Like, when you get feedback from a customer, they send you an email and say, hey, I love the app. I wish it did X. Like, that's a good sign. That means they like the app enough to open up their email client, then write down something thoughtful, and it's a big enough part of their life that they see it as something that could be better, could more fully meet their needs, and that's a good thing. But I've definitely gone down the rabbit hole many times where I'd look at that feedback and it'd be like, oh yeah, I should do that, I should do that, I should do that. And you can end up with a product, if you kept saying yes to every bit of that feedback, like by version 2 or 3 or several updates down the road, your app is going to look nothing like what it really was. Especially for like a smaller shop. Like, what makes my apps good typically is their like simplicity and the design around being really accessible, because I can't build big monolithic massive structures because I'm just one guy. I have to always be fighting that tension. And so typically what I'll end up doing is I'll say, hey, thank you for the feedback. I appreciate it. It helps like inform my future decisions. But I never say, or very rarely will say, like, yes, absolutely, that's a great idea. I will definitely do that. It'll be in the next update. Unless it's something, of course, that I'm already working on. But being able to say no to people was something that I definitely had to learn. It was something that I really struggled with early on. How do you deal with feedback from like the more general public to your apps?
You have to consider when you get feedback, when somebody is asking for a feature or asking for a change, it's easy to look at that and say, oh, well, if I can add this feature or if I can change the app to work in this way, then I will get X number of people that will be happier with the app or that might buy it who wouldn't buy it before. If you keep following that trap, as you said, like, it's very easy to basically have like the Microsoft Office 97 toolbar of app features. You get to have like this giant wall of features, really massive settings areas, and tons of just complexity and burden in the app. And that can very easily overwhelm not just an independent developer, but also the users who have to see all those options and don't understand them, or might configure them wrong and not understand how they got there. And so what you have to consider when you have people saying, oh, if only it had this feature, I would be happier, there are many people who are already happy with the app the way it is. And if you add things to it, or if you change the way things work, they might become less happy with the app. And so that's always been a very tricky balance for me with Overcast, because when I made Overcast, it was in part in response to what I was seeing from so many podcast apps at the time, which was just so much complexity in the interface and the settings and everything. And I wanted to make something simpler. A lot of people use Overcast because it was simpler at the time, and now, now there's a lot of great podcast apps now, many of which are that simple. but at the time, that was like a unique selling point for Overcast. And I never want to ruin that. And, not only for myself and for my customers, but also just like for the quality of the app. Like, if I add too many features, the app gets worse because it's harder to navigate. It's more complex. There's more edge cases that I might not be able to test as reliably as I test the core functionality. It's a very tricky balance. Like in 2.0, I added streaming, and I thought it would be amazing if you could just tap any episode, and before tapping an episode would just download it if you didn't already have it downloaded, and you'd have to wait for it to download before it would play. And in 2.0, I think, well, now I have a streaming engine. So if you tap on an episode now, I'm just going to start playing the episode, just start streaming it, and that'll be amazing. And to me, it was amazing. But the number one feedback I've gotten for 2.0 has been, how do I turn that off and just go back to the old way of doing it? Because I want to just go download a bunch of stuff. I don't want to start playback immediately. Now, downloading things requires two steps. You have to tap the info button and tap downloads. Look, now I've made the way that people used to do it a little bit harder because I thought the new way was better. But not everybody thinks so. And so now I have to weigh this decision of like, well, do I add another option for that? Do I change the interface to be more like kind of like the way when you tap a tweet in Tweetbot, it, rather than going directly to something, it expands a little like button panel below it. I've thought about maybe doing something like that. I have this problem I need to solve, and no matter how I solve it, if I leave it the same as it is now, or if I add a setting to just toggle the old behavior back on, which I think is kind of the worst way of doing things, or leave it the way it is now, in which case somebody's angry or the app is slightly worse, or I can do the tweetbot button row thing when you tap an episode cell, which will anger the people who like the streaming immediately approach, because now I'm making that 2 taps for them instead of 1. So none of these are perfect. And that's the thing, when you're facing app design decisions like this, and when you're dealing with people's feedback, nothing you do will be perfect. Nothing you do will satisfy everybody. And so you basically just have to you kind of have to develop a sense yourself, and you can see the results too, but you kind of have to develop a sense yourself of what will probably please the most people and result in the best app. I feel like it's relatively counterproductive to think too much about what were people accustomed to before, because all your new customers just see the new app. And the app, the app as a thing, the app as a concept, is what it is today, not what it was 2 years ago. And so even as you're bringing your customer base forward through updates, I always think it's way more important to have a better app today and a better app for tomorrow than it is to please everybody who wanted everything done the old way. So as I'm weighing this feedback about Overcast streaming versus downloading when you tap on the thing, I'm not really considering, do I give that option to people to just toggle it back the way it was before? Because that to me is like losing the quality fight, because that is just adding another option that new people will go into the app not knowing or caring what that does. If they accidentally turn it on, the app will start behaving differently, and they'll think it's weird, and if they didn't remember how they turned it on. So I'm not really considering that option. I'm more considering probably doing the tweetbot button row thing instead, because I think overall, if I was starting from scratch, now that I have many different things you can do on an episode rather than just tapping it to download it, that is probably the best approach. So that's probably what I'm going to do, because I'm thinking about what will make the best app if somebody looks at it for the very first time, not how do I please everybody throughout history, because not only is that not good for app quality, but it's impossible.
And I think it also speaks a little bit to one of the other traps that I know I've run into a lot with feedback, is the trap that it's very easy to overweight the feedback you get proportional to the size of your user base. So the only people you hear from are the people who are typically very upset or very happy. And the entire middle of your user base, which is probably in many ways the more important group of your user base, you hear nothing from. I've definitely fallen into the trap several times where I'll get a feature request once a week for 6 weeks, and from 6 different people. And because it's happening at this sort of interval, in my mind, it's oh, wow, people could keep asking for this. This must be really important. But then you take a step back, it's 6 people have asked for this feature. The app has 1.4 million users, and 6 people have asked for it. It's very hard to not conflate those things and make it feel wow, this is really important, because the only people you hear from, there's this self-selection for people who want things changed, whereas all the people who want status quo, or at least who are happy with what it is, you never hear from. And that's a really funny dynamic that you then have to balance with and get comfortable with, to say okay, is this, when I'm if I get what it actually is a lot of feedback. Has 10% of my user base reached out to me to ask me for a feature. If they do, that's probably worth paying attention to. I've probably never gotten feedback beyond every now and then where you'll accidentally ship a horrible crashing bug, in which case, fair enough, you hear from a lot of people saying, fix the crashing bug. And, that's good feedback I will definitely fix. But in general, you just kind of have to go with it. And I think where to wind this down is the focus on, in order to build software, I think you have to be able to have a vision for what you want the app to do. You're trying to build this vision. Maybe it's a bit abstract, but it's you want to have someone to they know it's yours. They know what the app is. It has a personality. Maybe that's the right way to say it. It's you're trying to create this persona that your app has, and doing things that ultimately will be counter to that persona are probably going to be counterproductive. When you get feedback that are people who are like, it's like, I like your app, but I want it to be something else. It's like they really want your app to be a different person, to have a different personality. And you have to then build this, this is the confidence even to say, no, this app is about this. Like, it's about simplicity and focus and ease of use. Or it's about, maybe it is a really strong, like complicated, advanced thing, in which case it's like, yeah, every feature I can think of, all the settings, all the options, the more the better. But you need, as a developer, to have that confidence to be able to say, like, this is what my app is, this is the way it should work, and to then just be able to go with that and make that work.
Sounds good. All right. I think that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Please rate us please recommend us on Overcast, and tell your friends about our show. Help us grow. And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.